Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 941 Vision of the Past, Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. Vast plains, high grass swaying in the wind like waves in an ocean. The inside of the dungeon was an idyllic scenery that resembled Kosdam's central plains. However, a darkness had come over the land, as the grass turned to grey ashes and the desolate earth was drenched in blood. The scenery the band of knights got to see as they entered was very different from how it originally looked. A black haze covered the now ashen wasteland. The corpses of orcs littered the ground of what looked like a guard station in front of the entrance. The black haze played around their ankles, giving birth to a hissing sound whenever it touched their silver shields. Whatever it was clear that it was harmful as it was blocked by the membrane of holy power they clad themselves into. Past the demolished guard station, in the distance, they could see a mighty stronghold. Was that the main site of the dungeon? Let's check this place. Before going to the stronghold, the leader made the decision, once everyone arrived. They got a little closer to the ruins of the guard station, before sending the scout inside. Argh! Get it off me! A scream of anguish echoed in the air, soon after the scout went it. But the scream came not from the ruin, but from the back of the group. As they turned around, they saw that one of the corpses, a massive orc warrior missing half his torso, had grabbed onto one of the knight's legs and sunk his fangs into his calf. His comrades did not watch for long, as someone immediately unsheathed their sword and slashed at the orc, severing its head and the remaining arm. However, the damage was done. The fangs had breached the silver aura and pierced the armor. "Quick, take off his leg armor, I will heal him immediately," the priest exclaimed, coming over and kneeling down beside the man. When the armor came off, the priest recoiled in shock. The wound just suffered had already started festering and necrotic veins began traveling up and down the leg. As he poured his magic power into the healing spell, the dark line slowly receded, much slower than his mana was able to recover. The priest quickly realized that he would not be able to save the man's leg. He needed to make a decision, as he still had to use his power later on. "Cut off his leg." Quickly, he said, and jumped back to make way for the slash that decisively cut the leg. Once the limb was severed, the stump was quickly healed and the bleeding stopped. What was this vicious power that resisted his holy magic so vehemently? "Vermont, you will!" The leader wanted to tell one of the men to take the injured and bring him out of the dungeon when they realized that they were surrounded. All the corpses had risen, breathing the dark haze from their rotten maws. On guard, with one call, the men formed up to defend against the horde of undead that suddenly rose around them. They faced the surprise attack with practiced skills and quickly cut down the Leave 65 undead. The lost leg stayed their only loss in this fight. They collected their scout, while the injured one of the men returned outside with the injured. Cautioned by the incident at the entrance, the band of knights slowly advanced across the desolate plain toward the stronghold. Although it was a depressing sight that weighed on their mood, the dry flat ground made it hard for any enemy to sneak up and attack them. Betraying their caution, there were no more undead randomly lying around, playing dead. Their nerves were strained for nothing, as the way to the stronghold was a peaceful walk. The gates of the castle stood wide open. The walls, the tower, and the court inside were all empty. Staying right outside the gate, the knights waited while it was the scout who entered alone once again. Their eyes scanning the dead plain, they waited for half an hour until the scout returned. "It's empty. I looked through every room, even the prison and cellars, but there was nothing. Not even a corpse. I think it's safe to enter." The scout shared his findings and conclusion with his comrades. The leader nodded slowly and took the lead as they entered the stronghold. Since the scout said that everything was empty, it should be safe, but the priest still had his suspicions about the whole situation. Why was the stronghold empty? Where had the undead gone? This seemed like a... "Priest, you think so too, right? Try using vision of the past in this place. We have to know what happened here and make sure our target has not already left," the leader whispered to him, so as to not demotivate their comrades. Vision of the past was a holy skill that took quite a lot of mana. It allowed him to use a fraction of the power of their goddess and take a glance at the past of a place or person. Although the priest preferred to save his power for emergencies, he agreed with the leader that it was necessary. The priest's eyes turned into the back of his head, revealing only white. Scrying into the past was costly, and the cost rose the further into the past he tried to look. He began with recent events. There was the scout, walking in reverse across the whole castle, then there was silence for a while. It was followed by a horde of undead orcs walking backward into the stronghold, where they quickly took positions on the grounds, in their beds, on the walls. The black haze that laid over everything slowly receded, and the corpses on the ground began the horrifying process of reverse dying. Screams flowed back into their lungs, erratic twitching on the ground, spittle jumping back into their mouths, bulging, yellowish eyes retreating back into their cavities until they finally were alive again and returned to the task they had before. Many stood at the walls and attacked something. At this point the priest had to choke off the vision. His mana was almost empty. However, he had seen enough. Desperately gasping for air, his eyes turned back, and he grasped the leader's shoulder for support. It's a trap. They deliberately left the stronghold open for. He stopped when he saw the knight look at him with a conflicted expression. The man glanced at the entrance, where the priest noticed that the gate had been closed. We already know, we fell for it. While the priest was in his vision, the stronghold was surrounded by undead who had risen from the undisturbed, dry ground. Outside, a horde of undead orcs had assembled. Although they were not strong, their numbers were intimidating. All they could do was close the doors and use the stronghold's defense to buy time. Seth observed what was happening with interest. He had put on the helm of Hades so he couldn't be tracked anymore and simply stood by as Hoskin did its thing. The golem was independently working out new tactics. As expected of the generic work of a god, it learned really fast. Not only had it used the undead for an ambush by having them play corpses, but it had also quickly changed strategies when it realized that this wouldn't work a second time. Now it had managed to use the den of a defeated enemy as a trap for the next one. Admittedly, Seth had helped a little by flattening the earth with earth magic, so it wouldn't look freshly dug. Still, right now it had surrounded the band of roughly 20 knights and forced them to lock themselves inside the stronghold. Some would say a siege was not desirable, but time was actually on Hoskin's side. Currently, the knights were shielding themselves with a kind of holy aura, but this still cost energy. Soon they would run out, and at that time they would fall to the black haze, the same way the orcs did. Seth was quite glad that failsafe worked and the haze automatically stayed away from him, although the blacksmith doubted it would be able to get through his defenses. Given the situation, Seth decided that it might be time to reveal himself. After all, these people had suddenly tracked him down and he was curious for what reason they wanted to throw away their lives. When Seth appeared behind the horde of undead, that was banging and grinding their bodies against the creaking gates of the castle, Hoskin also dug itself out from the ground beside him. A death knight pulling itself out from the ground like a zombie was also an unusual sight. The moment he appeared, the eyes of the knights were stuck to his body. It didn't feel pleasant to have a group of middle-aged men look at him so fervently. Hey, if you have the time to stare at me in this situation, you should also have time for a survey, right? The bard joked. However, none of the knights knew what a survey was, so they could only trade questioning gazes with their comrades. Why did you track me? Seth asked, slightly annoyed. These people were rude and did not get jokes. Oh, successor of Kova, please spare us. We are not here to fight with you, the man in a robe stepped forward, talking pompous. What are you even smoking? Seth asked, perplexed. I don't even know who Kova is and what gave you the idea I would fall for such an obvious lie, the bard blamed the religious man. If they just wanted to talk, they could have approached him when they marked him in the city, instead of tracking him down to the middle of nowhere. It is true. I don't believe you. You better hurry, I doubt you have much time left, Seth said uninterested, picking his nose. The power of voice of Seth swinging along with his words, irked the priest in a way the man himself couldn't understand. I'm serious, we actually. What did you say? I can't hear you over the groaning of the undead. You have to speak up. Seth interrupted him. However, before the priest could have a breakdown, the knight leader pulled him back. Successor of Kova, Her Holiness the Saintess of Kavala, the goddess of wit, wishes to meet you. Nah, I don't wanna. If you treasure your life, stop bothering me, the blacksmith simply shrugged and turned to leave. However, he did not call back Hoskin. Just because he wasn't going to kill them himself, didn't mean he would stop an ongoing battle. You goddamn heathen! Just you wait. Once Commander Herod arrives, he will teach you a lesson. A nameless knight couldn't hold it in anymore and cried out. Yet, Commander Herod will beat you half to death and drag you to Her Highness, whether you like it or not. Yet, the crowd incited itself. Don't think this stupid fog could kill us. The commander will be here and beat you before anything can happen to us, a very brave one, showed his unshakable trust in his commander. The bard slowly turned back to look at the band of knights on the wall that was hyping their morale. That just now almost sounded like a challenge accepted. With a clench of his fist, crimson flames licked up to the sky, as the whole castle burned brightly. Chapter 942 Unexpected Message. The man Ceres was pinning to the ground, was hard to look at. His whole body was covered in dark, worn robes and rags. Any piece of skin visible was an assortment of warts, festering boils, and other skin diseases. He was also the source of the stench. Mike made a step back. Lydia had the same reaction at first but observed the stranger's face a moment longer. Ray. Hubert, didn't I treat you well? I even gave you the freedom to wander around the city. And how do you thank me? You are trying to run away. A heavy thunk echoed in the small dim cell. The sound of a fist striking a body kept repeating over and over. The pain radiated through McCarthy's body, as he felt blood fill his throat and mouth. The hits finally stopped with a deep sigh. I believe you need some retraining. I will leave that to you, Barkus. The man finally ended, relieving his anger, leaving the torture to his subordinate. Barkus cracked his knuckles. Look at the defiance in your eyes. I love that the most. Let's keep going until it fades. What do you think? Hubert could only bite the gag and swallow down his blood and tears. Just when he saw a glimmer of hope, he was cast back down into the abyss. Chapter 943 A little over the top. Adventurer Guild's Holy Land. Commander Herod and a troop made up of 50 elites and 250 nameless heroes summoned through the powers of the dungeon were galloping toward the location the priest had given with his prayer when he suddenly signaled all of them to stop. He had just received a divine message, to pull back and return. It seemed that the priest and the rest of the band of knights and brought the ultimate sacrifice to relay a final warning. Their words and sight had reached the goddess. Clenching his fist above his heart, he sent a prayer to his goddess, before ordering his men to retreat. Seth was standing in the dungeon inside Legion's pocket dimension, looking at the singed corpses of the priest and the knights. The stench of burned flesh filled the cells. Their eyes and mouths were charred, as if columns of fire had sprouted out from inside their bodies. Why try to spare them? Hoskin asked in a slightly monotone voice. You know, killing them just for following me seemed a little over the top, although Ceres would disagree. What is Ceres? Something like a big brother of yours. That's right, the burnt bodies were not the blacksmith's work. The bard had meticulously made sure that none of them died in his fire. It was just a distraction so he could knock them out. However, something happened after he stashed them away for later interrogation. Because of Minasmar's current situation, most of his golems were distributed across their district. Currently, Legion was rather empty and there were no golems guarding the prison at the time. As such, Seth got the message that something was wrong with his captives rather later, while he was on the way out of the dungeon, to meet that Commander Herod, they mentioned. Some people may call Seth a cruel man, but he really only was cruel, when he felt justified in his actions. The knights had tracked him, and followed him, but they had not attacked him, yet. He felt it would have been overboard to kill them without interroga, without asking them for their side of the story. At no point did he expect them to commit suicide in their cells. The more sinister detail was that even their souls were gone. This is some kind of ritual. Ounce suddenly commented. A ritual? He asked. Seth brought the demon lyre out from his inventory, so the demon could take a closer look. Although Seth had learned a lot from the demon bard, Ounce was still the more knowledgeable when it came to this stuff. The lyre was gently floating around the corpses to take a closer look, while it played a quiet tune. Ounce had not suddenly learned how to levitate, but it was the skill of Seth's armor. Amduazia's spirit, check name again, allowed instruments to play themselves in this case, since it was an ego item. Ounce had to play, to stay afloat. This didn't mean his tune was without use. The demonic notes slowly seeped into the air, and an aura that Seth could not detect before became visible. A kind of dark golden smoke was floating up from the burned eyes and throat. This is the divine aura of a god. This was definitely a ritual. Ounce reaffirmed. What could it be used for? It doesn't seem like they sacrificed their lives for some ultimate attack, Seth pondered, looking at the cells that were still fine. Based on the symbolism and the lack of a soul, I guess they sacrificed their lives to send their souls back to their god, or goddess. Ounce gave his educated guess. Does that mean their god now knows what happened here? Seth quickly found the crux of the matter. The more complete a soul was, the more memories and personality it conserved from when it was alive. If this was a divine ritual and a god was involved, it was highly likely that their souls were preserved in almost perfect condition. Gods were special and their connection to their believers even more so. This was the reason it needed a powerful god to achieve something like a perfect resurrection. Highly likely. Ounce agreed. Then it won't make sense to stay here and wait. Seth left Legion's pocket dimension and returned to the dungeon, where Hoskin was waiting with his almost 400 undead orcs. Even the Leave 75 orc shaman, boss, had been turned into an undead servant who fervently followed the golem's orders. Since Hoskin's domination seemed to be based on a natural hierarchy or affinity and not on skills, it also didn't seem to be restricted by status or the number of minions. If he sent the golem Death Knight to Arjit Noer, would it end up becoming the ruler of all undead? The blacksmith shook his head. It was a funny idea, but he doubted intelligent and controlled undead would fall so easily for the Death Golem Knight's natural charm. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to sell Hoskin to Arjit Noer, even if it was just on the surface. Who knew where they would put it to use where Seth couldn't see it? He restricted his golems from harming Orihumas and Erdhands, so they wouldn't do harm here at home. But he could hardly restrict them from harming people in general. At that point, he would just be a bad weapons dealer. No matter how many restrictions he was to put in, once the golem left his influence, there was no telling what workarounds they could find. Honestly, the power of the enriched Necron had far exceeded Seth's expectations. Although the blacksmith didn't like having a horde of undead on standby, Hoskin was too dangerous to leave his hands. At least the golem's undead didn't stink. Since they were filled with the haze of death they looked rotten, but they were not actively rotting anymore. Pack up your undead, we are leaving Hoskin, the blacksmith gave the order when he left Legion, keeping the portal open for the undead orcs and one troll to wander inside. Although they didn't reek, they were not allowed on the couch, or in the building in general. As such, the meadow below the treehouse inside Legion was stuffed with bodies, resembling a concert. A groaning, undead rave. When he stepped outside, he was greeted by two more corpses. The knight who lost a leg and the man who helped him leave. These two seemed a lot less happy and peaceful about their death. Their faces were petrified in cries of pain and their bodies were stuck in a twisted position of struggle. How unsavory. The bard was not interested in waiting for someone that probably wouldn't come, besides the corpses of human sacrifices. This whole business left a bad taste in his mouth. The people he spared committed suicide and even the guys waiting outside found their demise. He had gained virtually nothing from this, except some hints from their lies and bragging. At least he knew one thing, someone, somewhere out there was actually after him, personally, and he had no idea who or why. He made a small mental note on the list of enemies and hidden dangers before he used home call. This short trip to test Hoskin had already taken too long. The first thing he did back in Minas Mar, was throwing out Hoskin and his undead. Although he didn't find out the truth about who exactly and why he was followed, he was still able to test the golem and come to a decision. He was not going to offer this miniature necromancer version of love to Arjit Noer. He had a better idea of what to offer them. As for Hoskin, since Python was now in Little Gamma and Ceres was traveling the unclaimed mountains with Mike, there was a vacancy to patrol the vicinity at their front door. Seth judged that Hoskin was strong enough to join as the second new guard. Waving at the golem knight's back, Seth watched as it and the 400 undead left for the vast mountain range to keep training. He felt a lot better, not having a horde of undead stored somewhere in Minas March. Is it really okay to just release those guys in the wild? Asterion asked doubtfully. Seth had almost forgotten about their sturdy gatekeeper. Don't worry. They will be fine, Seth assured him and returned to the workshop, to see whether his new idea worked better. But I was not worried about them, Asterion mumbled when he was alone again. With a sigh, he returned to his workout. It seemed like he, once again, wouldn't be able to get any action for a long while. Chapter 944 Somewhere Else, 27. Eastern Plains, New Hope. Admiral, the sensors picked up a settlement in the distance. We are also picking up massive heat signals grouped together close by, the man on the sensors exclaimed to the expressionless girl seated on the central chair of the bridge. Signal everyone to follow. Set course for the settlement. Maybe we can stock up on rations there, she commanded with slight interest. According to the maps, they still had some ways to go before reaching Gamma. Since this was no man's land, it had to be an old city from the time before the districts were founded. Who would have thought for the remnants of that time to survive in this day and age? At least this means we are not the last ones, her second-in-command sighed relieved. After leaving Epsilon in the far eastern corner of the continent, they initially planned to go south to Alpha, but they soon found that the whole south of the continent was covered by dark and aggressive forests. After losing several ground teams looking for signs of survivors, they had to change course. Crossing the northern mountain range and aiming for Sigma was also out of the question. The northern mountains were filled with powerful flying beasts that were a great obstacle for the fleet. Just entering the foothills almost overwhelmed their defenses. The colony ships that held most of the surviving citizens were too big and slow. If one of the beasts got through their defense, these ships were practically defenseless. Even the strongest adventurer died to fall damage from this height. The potential loss of so many lives was too high risk. With the north and south out of question, they could only cross the eastern plains and aim for Gamma as the closest district. This was where they faced a new problem. Earth had changed a lot. Not just flora and fauna, but the land itself seemed to have grown and stretched. Only after traveling across the plains for weeks, did they notice that their whole navigation was off because they were using the original maps, while Earth had expanded, and become much more vast. The weird discrepancies they had previously overlooked for various reasons made sense in the light of this realization. It also meant they had searched for Alpha in the completely wrong spot and had still been ages away from its new position. Now, the real problem this caused was their rations running low. They had barely time to prepare because of the demonic invasion. They were lucky the ships were still holding up, but they didn't have time to prepare ample food and water for everyone. Water wasn't hard to deal with thanks to magic, but food on the other hand. This was why the grey and grimy cityscape that was like ugly bird poop staining an emerald, as it appeared among lush and green plains before them, looked like an oasis in the desert to them. While the city was mostly desolate, their sensors estimated a population at roughly 75,000 living in the barely maintained parts of the place. The city itself seemed to have been quite big at one point. "Do we have any info on that city in our database?" she asked one of the soldiers on the bridge, who quickly started typing on his terminal. "I found the scan of an old map that shows a city fitting the size we are picking up. According to that, the name was Andomor, but I can't find anything else," he stated quickly. She nodded. It wasn't like she really expected anything. "Well, good thing our sensors function. Sir, the scans showed that the city had the early versions of a district's granaries. Although they seem to be mostly out of order, maybe we could repair them, if we stayed a while," the man at the sensors mentioned. These were good news. If they repaired the facilities and rationed what they had, they could maybe make it to the first harvest. If they succeeded, then maybe they could leave the civilians here and go look for their kidnapped brethren. "Admiral," one of the heat signals started to move. "It's moved directly into our way," the guy on the sensor reported. She rose from her seat to take a look at the being that stepped up to block their way. She didn't have to look that far down, as it was a humanoid individual that was almost 40 meters in height. On its shoulders stood a tiny person. No, it was a normal person, they just seemed tiny compared to the giant. "Who are you? For your information, this city of New Hope is under the protection of the giants of the Ruhr tribe." "State your business," the man on the shoulder asked, his voice enhanced by a skill so it could be heard even in the ships across the fleet. "Put me on the speaker," she told one of the men while putting on a headset. "This is the commander of Epsilon's aerial evacuation fleet, Admiral Amanda Fulcro. We mean no harm, but I would like to speak with your leadership." Her voice echoed from the various speakers of the fleet. The man standing on the shoulders of a giant seemed stunned for a moment before he came up with an answer. "I will have to ask my superiors. Please stay here while I will go ask them," he said readily. Well, it was hard to keep the semblance of an attitude in the face of a massive aerial fleet armed to the teeth and floating right in front of his nose. The tiny figure climbed down the giant and skedaddled back to the city. "Are you sure about this? I don't think these people are trustworthy," the old man, her second-in-command, commented. After all, this was a city that existed for decades, almost a century, apart from the districts. Who knew what kind of savages they had become at that time or after the introduction of the system? "If they pose a threat, we can still eliminate them, but until then, I would like to avoid thinning our people even further," she answered taciturnly. She was always ready to use force, even extreme kinds, but it didn't mean it was her go-to way to solve things. A great wisdom she realized was, that it was never too late to use force. While they were waiting, someone brought her a cup of tea. Said cup was half empty by the time a group of people exited from the city and came toward the silently floating fleet. Despite their docile action, they posed a looming threat by simply being there. We are here to escort you, Admiral. The Council of New Hope wishes to talk with you, the man at the front of the delegation declared in a neither haughty nor servile voice. Accompanied by 2 of her guards, she followed the delegation with a cold expression. Her intuition already told her that the city wasn't a nice place, full of scum and probably led by scum. But she wasn't afraid, not even perturbed. Scum made things easier. You could bribe scum, you could play with their greed, and if nothing worked, there was nothing to feel bad about in killing scum. Amanda felt relieved that she was likely going to face scum. It was harder on her conscience if she had to use force on the friendly and innocent. Seeing the town from the ground made it seem even more pitiful. She felt bad for the people who actually lived in this place, even their tight ships were cleaner and more comfortable than this. What surprised her was the overall strength of the people here. Since she was not a real admiral and didn't have the related skills, she could only estimate their strength by experience. On average, the beggars on the streets were already level 40, with the wretched crooks and gangsters hiding in the alleyways reaching 50 or even 60. They had a much higher average level than the people of Epsilon. But maybe that was necessary to survive in this kind of place. The delegation led her to one of the central skyscrapers that still seemed rather well maintained. This place used to be the base of a notorious gangster who put most of his loot into restoration of the place. Thanks to the man, who also asked the giants to protect us, we were able to get rid of him. Since then, the council resides here and tried to guide the future of our city, the guide told them with pathos, but Amanda was sure it was all bullshit. If she wasn't sure before, she was sure after entering the hall of the council. Each and every person seated at the table had an almost cartoonish semblance to gangster stereotypes. Muscled men with scars all over, thin men with treacherous mustaches, women with poisonous beauty, and old hags dressed like the proprietresses of brothels. It would have been funny if she hadn't faced them for real. All of their greedy beady eyes were glued to her, who brought great weapons of destruction to their doorstep. She didn't fear the cunning of mankind. On the contrary, she intended to use their obvious greed to her advantage. Let's get to business. We, the people Epsilon, would like to seek refuge in your city, for the time being. Chapter 945 to Moren 2. Minas Mar. The blacksmith was aiming for the alchemy laboratories when the person he wanted to talk to almost charged into him. Seth, Evie exclaimed a little out of breath. I felt a massive presence of death and it's moving north of Delta. A presence of death going north? The blacksmith halted for a moment, lifting his eyebrows. Then he realized what she was talking about. It's great to see you, I was just on my way to you. I think I can calm your worries. Let's go to the meeting room to talk, the bard finally said with a smile. Evie looked a little confused, but she obediently followed him to the Lord's meeting room to talk. Then Seth explained what he had been up to over the past day. So that presence I felt was the newest addition to our golem core I made from the prototype you rejected, yet. On that note, can you give me your necronite armor for the time being? Seth affirmed her conclusion and changed the topic to his business. The chosen of Persephone stared at him surprised. Why do you suddenly want my armor, too? No, wait, don't just change the topic. That thing felt really dangerous, are you sure it's okay to let that golem wander around? The immortal witch tried to get back to the topic. Sure. I told it not to hurt people. Its strength is a given since it's an armor of enriched necron we are talking about. It has similar power to love. He halted for a moment when he saw Evie looking at him even more incredulous than before. Love's powers had made the round, especially Evie, as an underworld fairy and chosen by the queen of the underworld could feel love's power even without the person in question displaying it. Currently, Reiki's bride was working as an assistant and bodyguard for Mary and Lena. He decided to ignore her look and continue. Anyway, I want your necronite armor to make a lesser version of Hoskin that I can sell to Arjit Noer as the prime product. In the meantime, I would start working. I would finish your armor set made of enriched necron, Seth promised. Evie stared at him for a long time, before she accepted that Seth wouldn't discuss his new creation too deeply with her. Can't you just make Cerberus make a new necronite armor? She asked with a sigh. She had just gotten used to the new armor, so she was reluctant to hand it back already. Unfortunately, I ended up giving Love all the necronite we had to refine it. We don't actually have any of it left. However, I'm sure we can get some from Arjit Noer, once they see what kind of golem it can produce, Seth admitted a little embarrassed. In the end, he got too excited and threw all the necronite at Love. Fine, you can have it, but I won't leave Minas Mar until you gave me my new one, Evie finally gave in. She lost her new armor, but at least could look forward to the new one. If the prototype lacking most enchantments was that strong, then what would she be able to accomplish if she had the finished version? That's the right mindset, Seth exclaimed, reading her gaze. Since he would get Evie's armor and would be able to make a, hopefully, marketable prototype, things were falling into place. Once he got the answer from Arjit Noor, and hopefully in a bunch of new enchantments, he could start on the final version of her armor. The unclaimed mountains. A weird group was sitting around a fire, cold winds blowing past the barrier that shielded the camp. A fairly normal-looking woman, a beastman with cat ears, a fairly ugly-looking man with horrible skin issues, a bird automaton with flesh of lightning, and a beast that looked like a reptilian giraffe. I simply didn't dare to return after I missed the big battle, Ray revealed with conflicted expression. After he was caught by Ceres outside of Emerald City, he had no other choice but to come out with the truth. He had tried to come up with excuses as he talked about his experiences on the journey. How he had traveled the unclaimed mountains, for places where evil gathered, to absorb it and gain strength. But in the end, he spiraled back to the truth. I thought I disappointed you. I was disappointed in myself and embarrassed. Since then I have been trying to be stronger and I have been kind of waiting for the right moment to return, he kept stammering. A soft head squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. Lydia had been his party leader for almost the whole time he had been part of Minas Mar. If someone in this group could understand him, it was her. Don't worry too much about it, Ray. We didn't need you in the first play, that's why Seth probably didn't call you, she said in hard-to-swallow truth. It may have sounded cruel to Ray, but Lydia was talking out of experience. They had also not been needed in that fight. At the time of their battle with the scene, except for Yulecat's fur, the other field teams had been stations across the various tree stations across Minas March. And the truth was, that past TS9, nobody saw any great battle. The scene had concentrated on the closest tree stations, where most of the refugees of Y City had been. That left Lydia, Jonah, and the others to twiddle their thumbs in anticipation of a surprise siege in their area. Ray looked her in the eyes, shocked to think that she would say something so cruel, but he swallowed his words, when he read the deep sympathy in her eyes. With a sigh, Mike explained her words, solving the misunderstanding. Aha, sorry. I guess this would have sounded cruel without context, Lydia laughed it off, a little embarrassed. After Ray shared his story, they fell in awkward silence, except for Ceres who simply didn't care. Sue, you know my story. What brought you guys to the unclaimed mountains? Solphium Saint finally asked. Lydia and Mike spent the next hour to explain the reason for their journey and their chaotic experiences so far. Oh yeah, Solphium also keeps going on about the old time and what is coming back with the awakening of the slumbering realm, Ray commented when they ended up talking about the exotic creatures that kept popping up in Beta and the rest of the world. Your god knows about it. Lydia and Mike exclaimed. Of course, after all, he is a remnant of that time, Ray answered, scared by suddenly being shouted at. Remnant. Can he help find that woman we are looking for? The Parrot of Doom interrupted, annoyed. He can't, but I probably can, Ray answered with a wry smile. He had spent a few weeks searching, traveling the unclaimed mountains, finding some of the darkest and worst places. He knew a thing or two about the secrets kept from the rest of Earth. If there is a place we can find out about this, then it's Moren too. It's a lawless city further southwest from here, in the foothills of the coast. Why do you think we would find the information we wanted there? Mike asked, surprised over a sudden direction. It's like a pirate bay for bandits. It's the place where all the scum gathers. It's also the place for the biggest deals, like slave trade, Ray explained. If they wanted to find someone sold into slavery, their biggest chance was there. I think that decides it, Lydia concluded. Yes, let's go to Moren too. Chapter 946 Casting. Minas Palin. Marco, Paolo, how are you guys doing? James greeted the two. They were sitting in the cafeteria of Minas Palin, together with the rest of the party they joined when entering the Oath Guard. Surprised, they looked up at the figure of James and Jess. Since Lydia, the leader of Field Team 3, was currently on a special mission, the rest of Team 3 were working as supervisors at the Holy Land. However, this didn't mean they were often in Minas Palin, as they kept accompanying parties to the Abyss to level up. The two greeted their benefactors enthusiastically, since it was their recommendation that allowed them to join the Oath Guard back then. James, I didn't know you two were back. Do you have time for a spar later? Marco spoke up and immediately asked the tank for a spar. His swordsmanship and other skills had kept improving constantly, and the other swordsmen or tanks he was able to spar with could really give him a challenge. "Geez, I just returned and you are already asking for a spar." James joked with a wry smile. "Marco, I'm sure James is tired from the journey and only came by to have a meal." "Stop being a nuisance," Paolo scolded his friend in a hushed voice. Still, Jess heard it. "Exactly. James is mine for the day. You can ask him to play with you tomorrow, if he can still walk then," Jess added cheekily. James rolled his eyes. They had been out for almost 2 weeks and Jess was on edge. "Anyway, I only wanted to tell you, that I recommended you guys for the casting. You can thank me later," he left them with these mysterious words. The couple got their food backed up and left for their private rooms. "You guys know Jess and James? How did you get to know them?" The question finally broke out of their companions after the superiors left. What casting was he talking about? They embarrassedly answered some of their questions about their relationship with them, although there was not much to talk about. Jess and James gave them a recommendation to join the Oath Guard because they took a liking to their attitude. Afterward, they were amicable acquaintances, but not quite friends. However, one question left them as clueless as their companions. "What casting?" "Mine is Mar." "What casting?" Soon after his conversation with Evie, Seth was also surprised by this sudden question. It jumped him while he was preparing the Necronite Golem. Now he was sitting in office on the lower floors of the embassy, facing the consequences of his own actions. Some time ago, he tried to push the task of choosing owners for the legendary items he made onto Mary. This time his tried and true method had failed him for the first time. What he got in return, was a list of people with the message any of these people would deserve it. Choose one yourself. He felt like Lena had a bad influence on his beloved secretary. This led to Seth spending most of the past 3 days in his office, taking auditions for the legendary items that were currently up for grabs. Namely the Harbinger of Winter Woes, a special rapier of ice with the legacy of a fallen god, the Jaws of Apep, a pair of twin Kapesh, and the Eye of the Storm, the Killer Wind Staff. It reminded him of the time when he had to choose people to recruit for the crafting department. However, it was a lot better since he got to meet a few of the longtime members of the Oath Guard and have a thorough talk with them. It had another good side effect. He was present when Larish and Larash suddenly appeared on their doorstep. This time, their arrival was much quieter, since Galwell had pulled back most of his people for the sake of their negotiations. Since he was in his office, he was called to the meeting room, where Mary, Lena, and Love were already waiting for him. Soon after him, came the 2 dark elves, while their guards waited outside the embassy. "We greet the Tower Master and his advisors," Larash greeted them with a respectful bow. The elf had become much more humble after their first encounter with Seth and the golems he made. "We came to notify you that Arjit Noor has accepted the treaty and your conditions for cooperation. The official statement will be made public in a few days. We came today, to bring you the agreed-upon items," Larish added with a bow of her own. With a wave of Larash's hand, a pile of treasure appeared. Not gold and items, but chests of necronite and various expensive-looking scrolls and valuable books. These were the master-tier enchantments he had been waiting for. He would finally be able to elevate most of his basic GoTOS among his enchantments to the next level. It was the last puzzle piece he wanted before making Evie's new armor and reworking one of his own. "Your gifts are much appreciated," Seth finally tore his eyes from the items and answered with a smile. "In exchange, I want to give you a sneak peek at our premium product I have prepared," he said. With a clap of his hands, a portal to Legion opened outside the door and the Necronite Golem made of Evie's old armor was spat out. Larash's and Larish's eyes opened wide when they suddenly felt the gloomy aura, unique to necromancy and dark magic. Seth had given them a similar test run as Hoskin and found that their powers were similar, but the Necronite Golem's was much weaker and closer to a necromancer who had to control the undead instead of the undead following its every order in reverence. Still, it was a genuine kind of necromancer golem that did not need a necromancer's soul or special necromancy enchantments. Although it was not as strong in controlling and raising undead, in exchange it managed to learn rudimentary curses and dark magic thanks to the enchantments originally meant to empower Evie. Most importantly, it did not share the same weakness as a necromancer, which was a weak body. The door opened and revealed a dark knight and reflective, crystalline armor. The gleaming dark aura and rose-colored tint in the eye slits and breathing holes of the helmet gave it a foreboding and intimidating presence. The blacksmith had been looking forward to their jaws falling open, and he was not disappointed as the two dark elves stared at the Necronite golem in shock. It was a good thing they didn't know it was a dumped-down version of the original prototype. He reinforced his suspicion that it was a bad idea to show or even offer them Hoskin. If they knew the upper limit, Arjit Noor might end up feeling threatened and become hostile. Is that a Necronite armor golem? Where in the world did you get so much Necronite? Larish could stay polite and exclaimed crassly to vent her shock. Her reaction in turn made question whether Necronite was as abundant in Arjit Noor as he expected. Larish, rein in your emotions. I'm sorry, Tower Master, for this rude behavior. Larash pulled her back and apologized quickly. No harm done. I didn't expect that kind of reaction, as I had the impression that Necronite was not that rare in Arjit Noor. Seth ended his sentence with an audible question mark. It was love that had implied that Necronite was naturally forming northeast of Delta. It was quite obvious that Seth understood this as it forming in the land of death that was created in the former region of Gamma. Well, you are right. It's not as rare as other epic materials, but it is usually reserved for the rich, noble, and powerful. It's quite hard, even for people of our rank, to get our hand on 1 or 2 pieces of it. Seeing a full armor of it, it is hard to blame my sister for her reaction, Larash explained a little embarrassed. Then we will have to raise the price, right, he said and looked over to the administrative heads, who were in charge of making the final prices. Ah! Larash was crestfallen, when he realized what he just did. Maybe they could have made a good deal, if he had just shut up. Chapter 947 Casting, 2. His heart quivered as he entered the embassy of Minas March. The day was finally here. Nervously, Marco adjusted his clothes. It was nothing fancy, or expensive. A simple button-up shirt and black trousers he got from a shop not far from the embassy. Looking forward to his audition, it more and more felt like he was going to a job interview. His thoughts kept revolving about the things he was going to say, or the things the other party was going to ask. What question would there be in a casting to gain the right to own a legendary item? He was sure it would be something about his class. His combat experience would probably also come up, he guessed. In his head, he tried to prepare answers about his class and skills and the work and adventures he had experienced so far. Deep in thought, he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. Calm down. You got this, Paolo told him in a calm voice. His best friend and priest had come along as moral support. Although James had said that he recommended the both of them, his friend decided to sit this one out. Officially, there was no information about the items the Tower Master had made to bestow upon the lucky ones, however, unofficially there were a lot of rumors. None of them had anything to do with priest or support gear, which was why Paolo only came along as Marco's moral support. Seeing his friend's calm smile, Marco actually managed to calm down a little. They had come a long way and overcame some tough times. Paolo's presence and smile told him that they would simply keep going. The world was not going to end if he failed this. After all, it ended already, and they were still here. You are right, I got this, he said, gathering his courage. No matter what, the interviewer wouldn't be scarier than the bosses they faced. That was what he thought until he entered the office and suddenly stood face to face with the Tower Master. Well, the Tower Master was sitting, but it didn't diminish his presence. Marco stopped in his tracks when he saw the man clad in dark armor. His instincts and survival skills screamed to leave at once, making his ears ring. Finally, the man raised his head with a bored expression, looking at Marco who stood there like a deer in the headlights. Come, sit, he said, leisurely pointing at the chair in front of his desk with the end of his pencil. The Tower Master didn't seem surprised about his reaction, and he spoke like he had said the same sentence very often lately. The next segment went past him like a dream, and he had a hard time remembering what exactly happened. All the questions he expected, they came, and he answered them like a machine. The words he prepared simply fell out of his mouth, whenever the Tower Master asked a question. Almost like it was fast-forwarded, it was over before Marco even realized it. It says here that you already signed a soul contract with us, the man in dark armor asked, looking through a stack of paper. Yes? Yes, I have, Marco answered hurriedly. You are rather short and slim, the Tower Master suddenly commented. His words stepped deep into Marco's heart. Why would he suddenly rent his heart? What had he done wrong to deserve such harsh words? Although you use a sword, it doesn't seem like you are using a specific sword art. Disinterested, the Tower Master kept poking at his insecurities. It was true, although Marco had crossed leave 85, his class was still that of a normal swordsman without specialization. He regularly visited the system church and tried to specialize, but he never got any of the cool classes he was looking for, as such he had never chosen a specialization. He would rather stay a swordsman than go down a path he didn't like. With your physique and experience, would you want to try and go down the route of a fencer? The tower master asked. A fencer? Marco exclaimed, perplexed. He thought the conversation was about to end and the tower master was simply disparaging him. Had he misunderstood? The swordsman looked up, seeing the tower master waiting for his answer. I do not wish to take a path I dislike, but I'm willing to give the path of a fencer a try, he said surprisingly confidently. Even if it was the tower master, he would be forced down a path that made him unhappy. Not even if it meant that you could get a legendary item for your hardships, his interviewer suddenly asked. In his words lay an overwhelming allure. Did this mean that this question was all that was standing between him and getting a legendary item? Even within Minas Mar, there was a strong sense of mysticism revolving around the idea of legendary items among the regular members, despite almost every member of the field teams having one or two. Just one could turn anyone into a powerhouse. Growing past level 90 would be a breeze. They could become heroes and make a name for themselves. With that kind of strength, they could protect what they hold dear. Especially the last point was a notion anyone on Earth shared. All of them suffered losses. Whether it was their homes, their wealth, their friends, or family, everyone knew the feeling of the world taking away something precious to them. The temptation was unimaginable, but still. Even then. If I don't like fencing, I do not wish to pursue that path, even if it meant getting a legendary item. Marco said, making up his mind. The tower master's finger tapped on the desk as he stared at the young man before him for a while. Good. Jess and James were right to recommend you. Take this and meet up with John Felton to train it. See if fencing is to your liking, he suddenly said and placed a long rapier and a book on the table. This is an epic replica of the special weapon Harbinger of Winter as well as a skill book for fencing, beginner, level 1. Don't think this is a guarantee to get it, you are not the only one who got this offer, there are 2 others. Even if you come to like fencing, the rapier will go to the best candidate, the tower master explained. That means I'm among the last 3 in the selection. Marco asked, kind of happy. Weirdly, he felt unfazed when the tower master talked about his competition. Yes, and you were the last swordsman on the list. Congrats. And suddenly Marco was faced with a hand. Mechanically, he shook it before the tower master sent him out of the door. Outside, Paolo was still waiting for him, looking up from a magazine when he saw the door open. Marco, are you already done? Let's go, you have to tell me everything, he greeted him with a smile before he saw the figure of the tower master behind him. Didn't you also come for an interview? Their boss asked Paolo. The priest had refused the appointment, but it seemed like the tower master still remembered him. I only came as moral support today, sir, Paolo answered surprised. The man who had once bought their boss seemed even more imposing than back then. No need to call me sir, we know each other a little. Come on, are you sure you want to give up on the chance to get a legendary item? His superior tempted him. Marco and Paolo were surprised that the tower master remembered their first meeting. I would not say no, but I heard there were no items for supporters, and I would like to stay a healer, he hemmed and hawed. So what? Do you think I will go through this ordeal for every legendary item I make? I'm making a list of potential candidates now, this is your chance to get on it, the tower master said a little moody. Paolo, go. Marco gave him a push. He already knew that the often timid healer sometimes needed a push to do something for himself. His friend looked at him hesitatingly, but finally nodded and followed the tower master. With some luck, they would both be able to own a legendary item in the future. Chapter 948 Somewhere Else, 28. Arjit Noor. The preparation to exchange the native meat sacks for golems was a hot topic among all circles. Even the lowest skeleton soldiers didn't get tired of clattering with their jawbones about it. Although they paid a hefty price for the treaty, it was seen as a positive outcome by most. After the reveal of Spacia's involvement with Y-City, the undead became careful. Although Arjit Noor could not fully compare to superpowers like Krina or Spacia, they had no intention of backing down. The golems they could purchase at a low price in exchange for a bunch of useless slaves would be a tremendous help in case Spacia decided to move personally. Only one person clenched his fist until the sinews of his hand cracked, at the sight of a convoy of ragged slaves being escorted out of the capital. From his high spire, he watched them with a deep bitterness eating away at his heart. With a scoff, he turned away from the window and fell into a luxurious chair. Moodily, he filled the crystal goblet standing on a small table beside the chair with wine from a carafe made of similar material. Taking a sip, the cool liquid flowed down his dry throat, soaking into his mummified stomach. He couldn't taste it, but at least it could invoke the memory of the time when there were feelings in his life. He had sacrificed a lot. He had done a lot he would never be able to repent for. Think that had him sleepless for weeks, thinks that had him puke at the mere thought. He had done a lot. He sacrificed a lot. He did everything to survive in this place. To the point he even let go of his own life to rise among the undead ranks. Contemplating, he stared into a tall mirror opposite the wall. Deep-seated, eyes glowing in a cold blue light. A face that was only half covered with flesh, the other exposing his blank skull. The incredible pain of being mummified alive, to change race to the highest rank of zombies. While others wallowed in their misery, he had stood up to face the pain to strive for a better future, but now, was it all for naught? Should he have also just begged and crawled on the ground like a maggot, waiting to be saved? His decrepit fingers dug deep into the wooden armrest of his chair. It's unfair, isn't it? An alluring voice suddenly whispered beside his ears. Disinterested, he kept looking in the mirror. Even if he didn't expect it, it was not enough to scare an undead. Who are you, to invade my spire so blatantly? He asked in a cold, hollow voice. Just a concerned bystander who wishes to help justice. Isn't it unfair that they get to leave just like that, but you can never return? A shadow thickened in the corner of the room, turning into the silhouette of a person made of darkness. The words struck a chord in his still heart, as it put into words what he couldn't grasp. The source of his bitterness, the irrevocable fact that there was no way back for him. Like a riptide, waves of regret he was holding back with excuses and pride washed over him. It was true, he wished for nothing more than to return to the time when he had a living body. A wish that was crushed by the reality, that there was no way back from undeath. And there was a mountain-toppling jealousy, that these maggots had done nothing but endure and they were rewarded with a price they couldn't even truly fathom. These bouts of regret and jealousy only fueled his bitterness and anger, like strong winds driving a wildfire. And despite that, despite all of the turmoil in his heart, his body showed no signs of emotion, like a calm lake. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't. He had no outlets for his emotions, so they could only eat even deeper into him. There is a way. A way to get it all back, a way to get back at all of them. We can grant you power if you are willing to cooperate with us, the shadow whispered. For the first time, the cold blue eye moved, fixing on the darkness. I know that I can't get everything back. You do not need to lie. But if it's a way to get back at them, all of them, I'm willing to listen to your conditions, the cold hollow voice echoed from the parched throat. Very well, the shadow answered with an audible sneer. Holy Land. It was a trap after all, the Saintess mumbled, biting at her thumbnail. She was walking up and down inside a vast and ostentatious sanctuary. Despite its size and opulence, she was currently completely alone. We expected it to be a trap. Her goddess answered calmly. Oh, Kavala, didn't we lose too many? Despite knowingly walking into the trap, she asked stressed out. They had lost almost half their knights on the expedition to Delta, where they were wiped out by an unknown force. Now they had lost a band of knights because they rushed things. The information the dungeon god had given them was twisted and devious. Some were true, some weren't. They should have never let it poison their mind, but now it was too late and the last few loyal men they had were constantly decimated. Why do you feel so anguished? I can always revive our fallen heroes, using the power of the dungeon. The goddess asked, unaffected by the small losses. She was still thinking like a monotheistic goddess who had a world of her own. The Saintess made a grimace at the thought of the things that were revived with the dungeon. It was true, since they were her believers, their souls would return to her embrace. The goddess could technically revive them with the power of the dungeon and her own. The problem was that both were lacking. The power of the dungeon only created mostly mindless drones, that mirrored the original in skill and power, but it was impossible to call them human. The goddess could have augmented this process, returning life to them, but she lacked the power to do so. Their once great goddess, who had ruled over all of them, had diminished to a parasite living in the mind of her Saintess. It was hard for the Saintess to suppress these thoughts, as Kavala was able to read the surface of her mind. However, deep down, the Saintess couldn't help but blame her own goddess for her arrogance and negligence. Their fall began with the holy war on the dungeons. Even though it was centuries ago, it was the tipping point that brought humanity to the edge of eradication. And now? They had become one of the many they had fought against. Drifters in the dungeon system, helplessly grasping at the chance to rebuild their home in a new world. They had pawned off their integrity for a deal with the dungeon god, as they were finally forced to surrender. Calm down, child, as long as we recover my power and grow the dungeon, I can bring all of them back. Kavala spoke softly, not blaming her Saintess for the turmoil of her mind. We just need to focus on growing now and getting you out of here. They did not suffer within the abyss, but only growing the dungeon was not enough. Only the Saintess would be able to set up their church, effectively and gather faith for herself. Yes, as you wish, O goddess, the Saintess Delpharia LV 165, boss, sighed. A dungeon break that could free her, it was not too far off anymore. Don't worry, we will not trust the information of the dungeon god again. When you can finally leave, we will travel west. West? What is in the west? Delpharia asked surprised. There was next to nothing in the dungeon god's information about the west. It was unclear whether that is good, or bad. Sheep, my child. I can feel a lot of sheep that need guidance. Chapter 949 Taylor's Request, 2. After his interview with Paolo, Seth was finally done with the castings, though the harvest was not very good. He had found a few people that were to his liking and the best candidates for now. There were 3 he currently preferred and some others like Paolo he wanted to keep in mind. As a candidate for the jaws of APEP, there was Ortega, the current commander of the Oath Guard. Previously he was the leader of the Oath Guard's elite team when it was still smaller. As a knight his build was tall and wide. The blacksmith really hoped he was going to be chosen by a god similar to Mahis or WebNovel. If Ortega got a transformation skill, it would look really imposing. Then there was, of course, Marco. Seth remembered the young party leader from the time when he bought the raw materials for Asterion. The young man had matured a lot and racked up a good track record ever since joining the Oath Guard, similar to his friend Paolo. Still, he would have to prove his skill, to earn this chance. However, the one he was actually convinced by the most was Morgana, the current leader of the elite team of the Oath Guard and formerly the wizard of Ortega's party. Although she was not a chosen, she had managed to change her class from wizard to Tornado of Terror, a sorcerer class specialized in terrifying wind magic and ability. She was the best fit for a staff like Storm of Death. On the other hand, like Allison, she was another proof that wizards, even former ones, were a little cracked. If she were to ever get a lunacy Seth might have to obligate her to wear an accessory set specialized in willpower, or she might lose it. It was good that the bard had long dropped all hopes to have normal people in his ranks. In this world, only the cracked ones could really rise to such heights. Although saying that might be a little unfair to the more normal members of Minas Mar, like Monique. After facing the consequences of his actions, he was finally able to set his focus on his new toys. Arjit Noor had delivered the Master Tier enchantment. Once he learned all of them, the quality of his new item would make a great jump. At least in the department of more common enchantments like attribute or mana enhancement. Before, the realm of Master Tier circuits and engraving was not Seth's expertise. It still wasn't, but after his exchange with Arjit Noor, he found that there were not as many as he hoped for. Not every handy effect had a master version of itself. It was simply because enchantment, which worked through physical channels, had its limits in what it could achieve. Unlike enchantment a magician used, which had near infinite possibilities, enchantment as used by Seth had not as many practitioners or researchers. There were simply not that many blacksmiths who were also master enchanters. There were many things engraving and circuits could do easier than traditional enchantment, but it seemed they also had their limits. Seth would have to be satisfied with his current means of enchantment. After all, it was not like he was restricted in that area. Now he had everything he currently could get to start with Evie's armor, and it had high chances of becoming the best armor he made so far, apart from his own, naturally. Planning to start the next day, Seth intended to end early, when someone passed him up on the way to his quarters. Seth. Wait. Do you have a moment? Nico Booz came running up from behind. The tailor was completely out of breath by the time he caught up to him. Nico, what's up? I was about to get back to my quarters. The blacksmith greeted the man, and patiently waited for him to catch his breath. He would never say it out loud, but their last meeting, when the tailor managed to turn fire into a thread had impressed him. Unconsciously, he treated the other man a little better. Would you be able to help me make another ball of fire yarn? I still need some more for the prototype fabric of the robe for Lixus, the tailor explained. Is it that urgent? Seth couldn't help but ask. Actually it is. I have to quickly finish weaving the 4 elemental threads or else their balance goes off and the fabric might unravel, the tailor summed up his problem. Nico had already managed to replenish his wind, water and earth threads from other people in Minas Mar, only fire was missing. Okay, I will help. Let's go to your workshop. Tower. With a single word, the tower ego teleported the 2 craftsmen to the tailor's workshop. Seth's eyes widened when he saw the bale of cloth that ended in rows of loose strings. One would expect fabrics woven from the 4 elements to have 4 colors, but it was actually almost white with an iridescent sheen. How intriguing, this almost looks like a finished product, not a prototype. Seth uttered as he scanned the unfinished cloth. It was a shame that his sewing skill was not high enough to allow his eyes of the maestro to appraise it. Apart from carpentry, the other crafting skills he had acquired stagnated at adept level 1 since he had not much need for them so far. I managed to improve and refine the initial flame yarn we made as I kept practicing with it and the other threads. Although it already looks great, I'm sure I can do much better when I start from scratch with my current skills, the tailor asserted confidently. His confidence was not without reason. The 2 quickly started creating more yarn from the fire. Not much changed for the blacksmith, he was still using ordinary fire, although highly concentrated thanks to his various passives and equipment. The changed one was Nico Booz, who managed to tame the fiery yarn with much greater ease. As his practiced hands moved, the thread of fire Seth created turned into yarn. Fire yarn, crafting material. Epic. A refined thread of yarn spun from pure fire by the hand of Master Booz, with the help of Master Smith. Well-practiced advanced skills worked together in the creation of this exotic material. Properties: high fire affinity, can absorb a certain amount of fire damage on impact. Nico's practice bore fruit, as the material was rated a whole stage higher than previously. Instead of a chance to hurt the user if used in equipment, it now had a chance to absorb fire damage. This was like a complete turnaround of the side effect, simply the tailor gaining more proficiency in his skills. This time, they were able to go on for a good while, creating 3 balls of yarn form fire. Before Nico finally collapsed, unable to continue. I think this should be enough for you to continue, Seth commented with a smirk. He had no idea why the tailor had pushed himself so much, but there was no way he could keep up with the blacksmith. They were simply built differently. Literally. It's not I could keep going, even if I wanted to, Nico gasped, melting in his chair. Nico, what resource do you use for this skill? It's mental power, isn't it? The blacksmith suddenly asked the tailor, his thoughtful look focused on the yarn. Why yes, my ability uses mental power. Why do you ask? The tailor asked a little surprised. If you had more willpower, do you think you could handle a stronger flame? One a little more special, the arsonist hinted at his idea. In his current condition, Nico's knee quivered at the thought of working with an even more brutal fire. However, he swallowed his fear and answered. I think could do it if I had more willpower, the tailor agreed. Unlike Seth who, despite being a blacksmith, had a strong focus on willpower, Nico was a true tailor and pumped most of his attribute points into dexterity. As such, his willpower was quite low and limiting the mental power needed to use his abilities. However, Seth could offset this with equipment. The reason he was ready to go that far, was because he just had an idea how to improve one of his most fundamental items. That's good to hear because I just had a great idea for later. You should keep practicing your skills, I will make sure you have the energy to succeed in my request. Chapter 950. Why don't we try right away? Minas Mar. Are you really going back to the workshop now? Finn asked, lying in the bed beside him. You have been staying longer, lately, Mina commented from the other side. Seth nodded with a smile. I'm sorry, but work has been fun lately and I keep forgetting the time, the blacksmith answered with an apologetic smile. He was being honest, it all started when he got his hands on the collection of enchantments from Arjit Noor. Apart from the basics such as Master Tier mana gathering circuits and attribute strengthening, he had also asked for those related to necromancy and dark magic, the specialty of Arjit Noor. Although the nation of undead was a little stingy and only gave the basics, it was good enough as a foundation of knowledge for Seth. Like with the principle Al-Zalsar taught him for her vessel, he was convinced to be able to further refine it with his own skills, once he fully understood it. 3 days ago he started studying, testing, and modifying the enchantments in an attempt to create an integrated magic circuit tailor-made for a set of full-plate armor made of enriched Necron. If Hoskin's abilities proved something, then that the inherent properties of enriched Necron were far above what the material description and flavor text led to believe. The death attribute was quite rare, so rare that the only other time Seth came across it was when he made the holy weapon for Lydia. Enriched Necron, however, overflowed with an aura of death, which could be a danger to the wearer. And 3 days ago, when he thought of making the integrated circuit, he was hit by a realization. To channelize and harmonize inherent power in a positive way was something Seth had only touched upon recently after he began learning about armor sets. And yet it was something that had always been in front of his eyes, though he never realized. The fire spirit gloves Tord had sent him a long time ago, the first legendary item he owned, worked on these principles. Many materials had their own inherent powers that usually led to passive effects of items, such as improved elemental affinity, a trait, or higher power of magic in some cases. Only after studying the master tier enchantments, especially those based on necromancy, Seth's culminated knowledge was finally at the point that he could try to understand Tord's work. He had at least an inkling of how the Dwarven Master enchanted the salamander leather, to enable options like unlocking the usage of magic without the need to own the skill. The true realm of a master was not just to understand and harmonize the properties of the material but to customize enchantments based on these properties, too. His approach to using the material's properties to strengthen an ordinary enchantment or choosing the enchantments to fit the material was only the beginning. Adapting the enchantments he used was simply the next logical step. Originally, he had asked for the circuits of necromancy and dark magic to directly use them on the enriched Necron, but when he was planning the armor set, this realization had hit him. For the past 3 days, he had been thoroughly re-examining the enriched Necron and its properties in detail, to attempt and modify the master tier enchantments. As if this was not already complicated enough, Seth also changed to armor design to accost the enchantments, as well as create the right spaces for demonic etchings. After 3 days, the final design of the armor ended up not being a set full plate, like the Necronite armor used to be. Instead, it was a set of gauntlets, cuirass, and armored boots, missing leg guards, or pauldrons. The reason for this was what happened on the evening of the second day. Yesterday, Nico was working late. He had finished the prototype fabric and was just occupied with putting the last touches on the test garment he made of it when the door to his workshop opened. Turning around, he saw the towering figure of the Tower Master in the door frame. "Nico, do you have some time?" the Tower Master asked, but not in a normal way, but like he was planning something. "Seth? I'm almost finished with this and then I wanted to go to bed, but..." "Sure, what can I help you with?" The tailor spoke hesitatingly but ultimately decided to see what the blacksmith wanted. "You see, I had this idea. You were able to spin the 4 elements into yarn and you are able to spin spells into yarn, couldn't you also make a fabric from a different power then, like say death or darkness?" the bard asked in a soft persuading voice. Nico was stumped at the sudden question, however, it made him think. In theory, he was not restricted in what he could spin into a yarn, ever since he became the tailor of Ivice. He had the experience of weaving magic from his class as a spell weaver and the power to spin the elements of the sky from the tailor of Ivice. In theory, I could do it, I think. I have no experience with those powers since I never learned a spell of that nature, but I could try, the tailor asserted carefully. Good, why don't we try right away? I have someone to introduce to you. This is Love. Present. Although it left Nico sick and bedridden, the tailor had managed to spin Love's power of death into several meters of deadly yarn in his first attempt. This was great news, kind of. As long as Seth managed to bolster the tailor's resistance and power, he would be able to make a fabric of similar nature to enriched Necron. This was the foundation for the new design, as the blacksmith planned to integrate the fabric of death into the design of the armor in the shape of a long gambeson that would improve movability and improve the overall image as a caster instead of a knight. Of course, it would take time to get Nico to the point where he could create this gambeson, but the initial thread he made was enough for Seth to infer the properties the gambeson would have and include it into the design and integrated circuit of the armor. Meaning he managed to finish the blueprint yesterday and could start today. Don't worry, I already did all the planning. All that is left is execution. I will be home early, today, he promised as he was getting dressed. We should also be back early. Should we order something from Link tonight? Mina asked, also getting dressed. While Seth was occupied with crafting, Mina and Finn were recruited for PR work, together with Bulko and Lixus. Since Mike was currently on a different mission, the rest of Yule Cat's Fur were following the suggestion of Lena and Jane to work on their public image. The three beauties and the benevolent giant were going around Delta and helping people who were afraid of fighting to gain levels in the local dungeons. Great idea, I would love some of his spicy soup and troll steak, Seth mentioned, his mouth watering at the thought. Troll may sound ugly and disgusting, and the being was, but the meat of the beast was tender and good for one's health. They kept talking about their plans in the evening, especially Finn, who kept preaching a list of meals, like it was a wish list for Santa Claus, while they ate a simple breakfast. They split afterward, Seth going to his workshop in the basement of Minas Mar, and the girls teleport to the system church in Delta. Back in his cave, the blacksmith studied the blueprint once again before he started his work. Usually, Seth used the demonic ballad of damage reflection on most of his armor pieces, this time he had decided on a different one. He had contacted Ember's uncle/grandfather, Dean Remington, and asked for advice since he never focused on necromancy-related works and didn't know any as such. The Dean went through the effort of sending him several collections of necromancy-related ballads and verses, as well as recommendations. From these, he chose the songs and poems referring to Murmur, one of the mightiest demons excelling in necromancy. He was a warlord with legions of undead, his mere presence could raise the fallen as his willing pawn. Not unlike Hoskin. The song serving this lord of the undead had a guttural bass and was less like words than any other demonic song before. Ounce and Cerebro accompanied the roars that resembled the angry cry of an undead, while the song pictured the image of a battlefield in Sivri's mind. Finally, the blacksmith's hammer, overflowing with magic power and covered in a small layer of pale blue flame, started striking the crystalline material, that was as black as tar.